So, what do I mean by level of measurement? So, level of measurement is basically the characteristics of the measure, the way in which you think about the variable itself. So, remember, you gotta be a scientist. You gotta start thinking about this and in like everything has to be broken down into its basic elements in order for you to be able to understand what it is and that's basic and how to use it. And that's basically what we're doing. We're breaking everything down to its basic elements. So we're going to take a variable and we're going to take the variable, right, which represents different characteristics from your subject matter. So let's talk about people just for the sake of argument. Now, I say that because I could also study, right, cities. And cities could be my subjects, and I could do comparisons on city, right? Income, average income in a city, average education level in a city, right? The average, transportation index. I can create an index on the level of transportation, how easy it is to go from point A to point B, those types of things. And each one of those would measure differently for each city, and then that could be my subject. My subject could be city, and the variables within the cities would be the things that would make the distinction, the characteristics that represent each individual city. So, percentage African American, percentage white, percentage, immigrant, whatever it is that you were measuring, right? Each city will have the specific characteristics for that. So, this is how so for our purposes, I'm just going to talk about individuals because the data set that I'm working on is the it's census data set. It's just collected from the U.S. Census. Now, this particular one is collected from what is known as the American Community Survey. It's collected every year, and it's kind of like a way in which we don't get surprised by what pops up in the census, right? It's a way to make sure that the census is taken accurately so we can kind of like, you know, not have poor numbers when it comes to the or questionable numbers, right? That's been an issue for a long time as to what numbers count, what doesn't, right? Now we know that the census has been doing a good job. Why? Because there are people out there who are trying to keep the census from counting certain people so that they wouldn't measure or wouldn't count as part of the population. It's crazy, but this is part of the process that takes place. But it shows you the accuracy, or at least the how well, given all the things that make counting people so difficult, especially when we're talking about over 330 million people. Uh, why it makes it, it still pretty does a decent job. Not great. There are people who are missing from the U.S. Census, and we know that because we do these other type of ways of counting. Anyway, so we're using the US Census. It deals with individuals, so we're going to talk about individuals. So individuals have different characteristics, right? Based on a particular variable. The variable is the overall definition of what those characteristics are. So a variable could be age. Age differs from person to person, right? Now, how do we count age? We count age by year. Doesn't matter where you were born. So if your birthday is tomorrow, and today you're 20, then you're 20, right? You don't become 21 until tomorrow, right? So it doesn't matter if your birthday's tomorrow, it doesn't matter if your birthday is a year from now because your birthday was yesterday. If you're 20, you're 20. No one says, oh, well, you're 20.268. No one goes into any of those details. It's either 20 or not. So it's recorded by year. So you have to understand, right, in its basic elements. Now, could you get more specific with age? Absolutely, but does it matter? No, right? That's the human element of this, right? This is where it becomes, you understanding the elements and how they work within society, right? You don't get ridiculous about these things. There's a practicality that's involved in this. Is that 100%, accurate? No, right? And that's where we run into slight errors in what we do, is that not everything is 100%. But you have to understand that we are dealing with human beings and we're dealing with, the practicalities are of what we do, right? Of how human beings operate as best as possible. So age differs from person to person. Now, what kind of variable is age? Well, age is measured by year. And this is where the elements come in. Well, because it's measured by year, right? You can actually tell how old someone is over someone else. So let's say that a 16-year-old dates a 15-year-old. Well, that's acceptable. That's okay. There's only a year difference between them. That's not a big deal, right? Oh, but let's change it up a little bit, right? Let's say a 22-year-old dates a 15-year-old. Well, then that's problematic, right? Because that's statutory rape in some places, right? So this could be extremely problematic right off the back. So, oh, switch that around and say a 22-year-old teacher is dating a 15-year-old student, and forget it, right? That is like whoa, over the line kind of process. So we measure, right, how old someone is by year, and we can tell how much older someone is. Now, again, don't ever forget that there are real politics involved in the measures that we're using. There's real social implication in the measures that we're using. And what I want you to understand is that you're not removing those things, right? As a matter of fact, you're being very accurate with those things. So when you think about how much older someone is versus you can actually tell how much older someone is by the number of years that they have, right? Because not only can you say someone is older, but you can tell by how much someone is older, in some cases where it could be problematic, right? That's the social part of it. I don't want to remove this social part of it. So, you know, uh, that is known as an interval level measure. Why is it an interval? Interval level measures allow you to measure variables and be able to tell how much greater or lesser one characteristic is compared to the other characteristic, right? In this case, someone who's 15 is much, much younger than someone who's 22. Yet, if someone who was 32 was dating someone who was 22, there is less question there. You might still find that a little troubling, but there's less question there. Legally, there's no issue there, even though the person is 10 years older, while the other person, the 22-year-old dating the 15-year-old, is only 7 years older, right? That's the social elements of what we're doing and why you never remove the fact that you're dealing with human beings from the statistic that you're doing, from the variables you're observing. But you could tell, right, with the interval level data, how much older someone is to the other person. And you can tell by how much. The ratio in here, we're going to treat as interval level data. Ratio just means it's an absolute zero. Now, very few things have absolute zeros, right? When you're born, no one is 0 years old, right? And other characteristics that deal with numbers, you rarely have absolute zeros, right? There is absolutely no way that a person can have absolute zero income. Oh, you're saying, oh, that's not possible. Of course you can have zero income. You just don't make income. Not really, right? Because the person still needs to survive, and this person still costs. So there's always debt associated with a person if there is no income being generated. So absolute zero means a little bit more than that. It means truly absolute, and this is why ratios tend not to be talked about too much. Ratios usually are when you're dealing with percentages, right? When you're dealing a percent of something, that's usually when you're dealing with ratios. But in real life, among human beings, we normally don't find ratios, so we talk about it in intervals. So interval and ratios we use exactly the same. Nominals are easy. Nominals are characteristics that are different from each other, but are not measurable in any sort of way. The distinction is not measured by determining whether something is greater than or less than. Now, you could have preferences, but you cannot have something being seen as greater than. I'll give you an example. Let's take religion. You can have a preference for religion. You might decide you're Catholic. You might decide that you are, some denomination of Protestant. There's plenty of out there. You might decide that's what you are. You might decide that you're going to be agnostic or atheist or whatever religion that you decide to do, right? Whether it's spiritual, Wicca, whether it's Buddhist, right? The reality is that that only identifies a characteristics and it doesn't measure against others. You might still have a preference. I prefer such religion. I prefer no religion. But the reality is that you really can't measure one as being greater than the other in practice